Hey folks, I'm Will Jarvis. Along with my dad, Dr. David Jarvis, I host the podcast Narratives. Narratives is a project exploring the ways in which the world is better than it has been, the ways it is worse, and the paths toward making a better, more definite future. I hope you enjoy it. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. You can get on our mailing list, find show notes, transcripts, as well as videos at narrativespodcast.com. Thanks. I think we're good to go. Well, Quinn,
Hey.
how's it going, man?
Pretty good, you?
Doing good. It's great to have you back on.
Oh, thank you. It's really nice to be back on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're sitting here. It's a sunny day in Wake Forest again. I wanted to get started. We've thought a lot about, and we've been talking about a lot, hierarchy.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get started on that topic. What are some general thoughts you have on the subject?
Well, I'm moving into, it's interesting. I'm moving into treating it as the object of analysis rather than as foreground to considering some specific type of hierarchy.
Gotcha.
So I'm used to thinking about military conflicts, and you assume the military has a hierarchical structure,
Right.
and you think about why that would make sense in terms of winning the conflicts. But you're still thinking about the winning the conflicts is the thing in the foreground, and the
Right.
hierarchy is a means to that end. And I'm moving into thinking about it independently. I mean, as something that people have emotions about independently from whether it achieves goals or has bad side effects necessarily.
Gotcha. So something like hierarchy as the object of what you're looking at, and that's the main thing. And,
Yeah.
kind of forgetting about everything else, like in a specific case or anything like that.
Yeah.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. I like it. Hierarchy is, I get the sense, before we jump into it too much, that different people have different kind of attitudes toward hierarchy.
Yes. I was seeing a really interesting discussion on this web forum I used to read between an anonymous poster who said that he has strong preference for hierarchy, and someone else who has strong preference against it. And what was neat about it was that they were both doing a really good job of distinguishing having the preference for the thing inherently from thinking that it has good consequences. Because how this sort of thing usually works is that if you like hierarchy, you argue that it helps us win more wars. And if you don't like hierarchy, you argue that it doesn't help us win that many wars. And you don't address. So that was the light bulb that made me think, okay, people care about this thing for itself, and not just because it gets us these things, but it has these bad side effects.
Interesting.
I think, knock on wood, but I think tariffs are an example of something that I always use rhetorically. Tariffs when I need something that doesn't stimulate emotions but has policy. People care about tariffs because of the second order effects, but just about no one has deep and powerful first order effects about tariffs. Yeah.
Gotcha. No, that. Yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. People tend not to. So it does seem that people have some inbuilt preference around hierarchy.
Yeah.
And maybe should we define hierarchy? Is that too tautological to just go ahead?
No, I don't think it's too tautological. I'm not sure that I haven't tried before.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. I tend to think of it first in terms of the structure.
Gotcha.
Nodes communicating to other nodes.
Gotcha.
In a sort of tree-like structure.
Got it.
So non-hierarchical structure, all the nodes have equal relationships to each other node. In hierarchical structure, they usually have to go through other nodes to get there. But I'm not all sure that that's the core of it.
Maybe it's something like sometimes, like if we're going to... So maybe it's like in contrast to there's hierarchy, and then there's like, so maybe there's like a plane, like egalitarianism.
Yeah.
Is a just everything's level.
Yeah.
And then hierarchy, is the fact that sometimes, you need to order people or people are ordered. Sometimes they have different, varying levels of skills or something like that, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or levels of anything.
Yeah.
So it does seem like the current milieu, like the current zeitgeist is very anti-hierarchy. Do you think this is the case?
Yeah, that is my sense of it. That egalitarianism, I think you get strong resonance for that being good in itself. And I think it's rare to find people who will come out and say they think hierarchy is good in itself. But I'm curious how deep that goes.
Right.
There's this recurrent pattern where, I'm not sure I can quite describe it, but where in this case it would manifest as people who feel that the hierarchy is legitimate don't call it a hierarchy. So I think I first noticed this when we were talking about power. Legitimate power doesn't count as exercising power.
Gotcha.
Because power is what we say about bad exercises of power.
Gotcha. And it's kind of this real distinction. Why do you think there has been a tilt towards egalitarianism? Is it just like this byproduct of getting richer over time?
I think that's what Robin Hanson thinks.
Gotcha.
And I at least don't discount him lightly.
Yeah.
I think there might also be a game theoretic aspect, because there are a lot of possible hierarchies.
Right.
And so it sort of makes sense that people who want hierarchy would be divided among themselves about which hierarchy to get, and people who want no hierarchy might end up being the largest coalition just because there's only one way to have no hierarchy, and there are many different ways to have hierarchy.
Right. Definitely. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
If we're going to map it to left and right, I'm assuming, we would think more left-leaning people would be definitely anti-hierarchy, like the farther left you went.
I hear that, yeah. I never know if I'm quibbling too much or...
No, yeah.
I used to think that was a really good candidate for the underlying difference in intuitions, if we were going to pick one.
Right.
Because I think a modification that I devote some bandwidth to is that the right likes formal hierarchy more, and the left likes informal hierarchy, maybe based on prestige or influence.
Interesting.
I think a lot of people on the left have a very strong intuition that, for instance, if it were to come up, that the police should not treat Dr. Fauci and a homeless vagrant the same way. But they have a very strong aversion to formalizing that.
Oh, interesting.
And so I'm seeing some people who I don't think are actually anti-hierarchical in the sense of being egalitarianism, but really don't like formalizing it.
Oh, that's interesting. That's really weird. So, and that almost makes it sound like it's a case where, maybe, yeah. Is it a case where maybe it is the farther left, the less of a preference you have for hierarchy, so you want to kind of deny this aspect of how humans work, is that, if you order people any different way, some people are going to be at the top, some people are at the bottom. Like height.
Yeah.
We all did height. Like some people will be taller than the others. And if you have a preference against that, you don't want to formalize it. You don't want to reinforce it in any way.
Yeah.
You want to try and escape it. But if you're on the right, you're like, well, maybe we need to, formalize this in a more robust way.
Yeah. I think so. It's complicated.
It's very complicated.
There's a perspective I'm not seeing as much of as I would have expected. And I'm not sure I really want to adopt the perspective as my own, but I feel like it deserves a seat at the table, which is sort of like let's have hierarchy, but let's have it targeted. So I used Fauci. He seems like a sort of good generic example of a high status person. He definitely knows more than I do about biology.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of evidence that he knows more than I do about philosophy.
Gotcha.
I should definitely defer to him in matters of biology.
Right.
This doesn't have very strong implications at all for whether I should defer to him in matters of philosophy.
Right, absolutely. Do you think, in some sense, the world has gotten okay, so the more people you have competing in a globalizing world, the lower you can end up in any given hierarchy?
Yes. One bigger pond.
Right.
That's cool. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
It's interesting. Do you think that... Oh, man. Do you think that plays into...
I bet it does.
It's interesting. I don't have fully formed thoughts on that at all.
Well, if you have more status systems, then just about everyone can be high status in one of those systems and treat that as the important system.
Yeah.
I think we interviewed David Friedman
Yes.
here once, and he said that when he was in college, it was very much like that. That you had subcultures, and each subculture had its own status system, and each subculture regarded that as obviously the important status system.
And if you can win in one,
Yeah.
you're good. Yeah. It does seem like a real problem. You know, these things are all tied up with status and that it is, hierarchy is inherently zero sum. I mean, except what we just described is kind of like a special case. It's kind of adjacent. It's like, well, if there's more hierarchies you can participate in, maybe you can find one where you can excel at.
Yeah.
But it does seem to be a real problem that, globalizing world, there's more and more people competing in each game. It used to be if you're in your small town, you could be, the smart person in X way or do something impressive. If there's only 1,000 people, it's a lot easier than if there's 8 billion.
Yeah. Well, it's interfacing with Dunbar's number, I think. I mean, people only have so many slots, so
right.
You're competing with people you're not going to meet.
Yeah.
That's the different thing.
And what's Dunbar's number, just for...
It's at least theoretical limit on how many people you can mentally simulate in depth. How many people can be real to you. Because in the ancestral environment where humans evolved, there wouldn't have been that many people. And you would have... So, I think it sort of explains why if you meet a friend you haven't talked to in 10 years, things are awkward. It's probably not the only explanation, but if you've reused that slot to stimulate someone else, it can be hard to transition back into.
Right.
Because it's usually thought to be like around 150 people, and I'm pretty sure I've empathized with way more fictional characters than that. So we have to be capable of reusing slots.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe there's a look-alike. Like how many different kinds of broad archetypes are there of people?
Yeah.
Goes into it a little bit, probably.
I think probably pretty strongly, yeah.
Whatever a broad archetype of a person is. I don't know exactly.
Yeah. I think it explains why when I visualize bringing all the people together, it doesn't seem like this should inherently result in more people being lower status. And I think Dunbar's number explains why it might. That if you're in a small town and you're the guy who knows everything about fish, everyone's going to look to you. But whereas if we combine all the small towns, there's only going to be one guy in all of them who knows everything about fish. Right. So if people have the bandwidth to track that you're the 495th guy in the fish ranking.
Right. Do you think... Well, maybe there's also some trade-off, right, where you get specialization.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like maybe you can be like the fish expert for trout or something, you know what I mean? Because you're in a bigger pool.
Yes.
But I don't think it like covers... I don't think it it completely makes up for the fact that you could be, in this small group of people.
Yeah.
You can only keep so many people in your head at one time.
Yep. I think so, yeah. I'm confused about how things don't seem bad enough for it to be as zero-sum as it intuitively seems like it should be. I mean, people seem really tremendously motivated by status.
More than money.
Yeah.
I think this is like a super underrated fact, right? Like,
strong agreement.
It's very bizarre.
I think a lot of what looks like concern about money is concern about status, and money is a way of keeping score. I think a former president of ours said that once.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Is there any sense that you have that this is something that can be escaped or diminished? One's concern about this kind of thing.
A model I have in my head that I use, and I may have brought this up before, but I use it again and again in different areas, is the space program.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the space program from not even like a hunter-gatherer's perspective, but the perspective of anyone who hadn't grown up hearing about the space program.
Yeah.
We made a large, heavy hunk of metal shoot straight up into the air. And so far up that it moved away from the Earth. It's like the archetypal example of something that ought to be impossible. I mean, if you were going to look for a constant, something that's true all the time, the laws of physics would be a good candidate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you want a good intuitive demonstration of that, you would go with heavy things fall down.
Exactly, not go up.
So I think there is a recurrent thing that I would say intelligence does, or optimization ability, where you line up the loopholes just right, and you get an incredible result. And then it becomes the new normal. We have planes now. I mean...
Right.
So I think I often look at whether there are loopholes we can line up, edge cases, that will get us out of a bad dynamic.
So is it something like, if you can create a new frontier?
Yeah, or in this case it was, if hierarchy is mostly zero-sum, but there are a couple of tiny little loopholes, then maybe we can parlay those tiny little loopholes into making it substantially not zero-sum in the way that matters to humans. I mean, I think this really comes down to the idea of hitting tiny targets in optimization space. If you run a tornado through a junkyard, it will almost never assemble a car.
Right.
But a human can get a car just about any time they want by threading that needle. And it's tricky because when you're speculating, you don't know if we can do that. I mean, the light speed limit on space travel might be absolute.
Right.
So you never want to say, we can definitely do this, look at the space program.
Yeah.
But I think the space program should give us permission not to assume that we're being naive if we look at something that seems impossible and go, maybe we could make that not impossible.
Right. And like, how can one should be open to try and, finding things like that.
Yeah. I think maybe we don't adjust for the idea that you can combine improbabilities. So if heavy things mostly fall down except for this weird edge case, and this weird edge case, and you combine those, I don't know, this may just all be really incredibly basic, but I think a truly zero-sum world is kind of really scary.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
very horrifying.
And it would be nice if we could find a way out of that. And
by zero-sum, we mean someone, like, to win, someone has to lose.
Yep.
There can be no... But, and Robin Hansen's super bearish on this. He's like, this is just a fluke. We're going back to, feudalism in a long enough term.
Yeah.
Do you think it's something we can continue to escape is like this reversion back to the zero-sum Malthusian environment.
I think...
Where you just make enough to cover your calories.
Yeah.
Or barely.
Well, I think that's certainly... It's the high entropy situation. So... Well, it's a high entropy situation. I think we probably can't escape there being some sort of constraint, which
right.
we're not meeting. But I'm hopeful that we can shuffle it to a constraint that doesn't hurt as much as starving to death.
Right. This actually got me thinking. Well, perhaps we should think more about how we escaped it in the first place.
Yes, I think that's a really good idea.
You know, like, what the heck happened, dude?
Yeah.
You know, like that is an understanding why and how you keep that going seems like incredibly important. I know this echoes like what Patrick Collison, you know, that post in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
About there needs to be like progress studies. We need to work
Oh
on
yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and like Jason Crawford's kind of taking that mantle on, and there's a lot of good work happening, I think. Yeah. But it's a mystery, and it does seem like very important to keep it going.
Again, tell me if this is too general. I'm seeing humanity do incredible stuff. So there's a story you can tell where we are incredibly capable.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm seeing us fail at really basic stuff. For a while, we had vaccines and we were not putting them in enough arms.
Yeah. And it's like, wow.
And it seems like it would be useful to figure out if there was some sort of rule for when we're going to fail at very basic stuff and when we're going to do incredible stuff. I'm not even necessarily... I've heard people argue that the space program was mostly a waste of money.
Oh, yes.
I'm not arguing against that. I'm not saying it is great that we did it. I would have to study way more to know. I'm saying it would have looked absurdly improbable to someone.
Yes.
So the fact that we did it demonstrates that we can sometimes do absurdly improbable stuff. And I think I've thought a lot about when we're going to be super capable and when we're not. And I think part of it is realizing that it's improbable. The space program looked ridiculously... Going to the moon looked ridiculously hard. So we approached it as ridiculously hard.
Right.
When we expect it to be easy and we're wrong about that, then we keep trying the intuitive strategies that don't work.
Yeah, it seems like you have to be very aware of, you know... I'd like, you know, this, and I bring up this book, I think, like every podcast, this example. And I'm only going to bring this up because I don't know enough about the space race to talk about it well. I've been reading this book. It's by General Groves, and he's the guy who managed the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
And he talks about in the beginning how, you know, they weren't exactly sure. Like, they were pretty sure it was possible.
Yeah.
And they thought it was a good enough chance it was worth trying.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was all these conscious efforts to try to, you know, how do we manage away risk in this area? You know, how do we manage away risk in this area? Like, what can we do to make it, like there's this discourse about risks. You know, we need to take more risks. And I think that's just like the wrong way to think about it. Like the way like he approached it was, how do I minimize the risk in each of these areas to the absolute minimum? You know, what are my bets? Like, what are the real bets I'm making? And I want to be very conscious about how I make those bets. But it seems like now, you know, you hear all these like that line, like, we just need to take more risks. Seems like the wrong way to think about it, you know?
Yes.
We don't want to take risks. We want to be
yes.
successful, right?
Yeah, it seems like cargo culting it. Selecting something that maybe correlates with doing it, like taking the right risks and then optimizing for that.
Yeah, as best you can.
Yep.
So it's funny. Two thoughts broadly, generally. Peter Thiel has this idea that, like, one of the big problems with like what I just described was people not thinking through things in robust ways. Do you think we've gotten we are worse at like what's it's like a sociology thing where people would just get like why would people, you know, try less hard or like think less hard about things? Is it like something where if you're not, your life's not on your line, if it's not the Russian bear that's going to come and these godless Soviets going to invade, do you just like not try that hard?
I think it's likely to be multifactorial, so I never want to do that thing where I spot a cause and I inadvertently hold it up as the cause.
Why is so tough, man?
Part of it is Dunbar's number, that Dunbar's number interfacing with communication technology. Just about any decision we make at a high enough level of policy is going to screw over a photogenic orphan somewhere. And it used to be that maybe you would read about these people in the newspaper, and now we have 4K video. Now, if you're in a tribe of 150 people and one of your policies screws over one member of the tribe sufficiently, that's kind of a problem.
Right.
And we are not adjusted to this is happening to literally 1 in a billion people. We can't process that.
Right.
So,
because it's in the context of Dunbar's number, it's like, well, this is probably like 1 in 150 or 1 in 200. Like that's, which is pretty bad.
I read people talking about the FDA, and thalidomide gets brought up again and again and again, which should make us a little just suspicious that it's always the same example.
Can you talk about thalidomide, what it is?
It was a drug that we approved, and which, if taken
like
by
sickness, right?
Yeah.
This is the yeah.
Well, I think other things too.
Gotcha.
Because I read somewhere that some countries are still using it, and that it's perfectly fine when it's used by anyone who's not a pregnant woman.
Gotcha.
So the sensible thing would be to approve it for anyone who's not pregnant.
Right.
But if you take it while you're pregnant, the fetus is very likely to have birth defects.
Gotcha.
So it's an example of a place where we underregulated, and where I gather we regulated more than some European countries who had worse results. Again, this is hearsay. I haven't. I'm pulling together stuff I've absorbed through osmosis.
Got it.
As opposed to like having a Scott Alexander post about it, where I'm pretty confident that I have
right.
So it's an example of why we need regulation, but it's an example that affected a handful of people.
Right.
And regulation also has costs, and
yes.
at a certain point, those costs vastly exceed the benefit.
Right.
And so it's sort of weird. I think it points to something. Even if there were lots of other, even if my general bearishness on the FDA regulating things was wrong, and I knew that, it would still be pointing to something about human thinking that we bring up this same example again and again and again, which is statistically almost nothing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's like the the example we keep bringing up that's very potent. And there is some sense in which it's like, I went through this program at UNC, and, we talk about Baudrillard. It's very like, a lot of it, I think, was not very intellectually rigorous like I would like. But some of it is true. There is some, like, one of the big takeaways I have from Baudrillard was how important the spectacle is.
Yes.
Like that, the spectacle really matters in weird ways.
Yeah.
Like you said, like, like it's very like vivid, like children,
yes.
Birth defects, like it's very vivid, and like that always destroys, like that wins over statistics any day.
Yes. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
And it's certainly an obstacle sometimes if the statistics are pointing in the other direction.
Right.
I agree. It's tremendously and I don't know how much of that is people being low information and it being easy for them to process examples versus thinking imagistically.
Right.
So they think the example proves the point, which makes sense in a Dunbar-sized tribe.
Right. It seems to work very well in that sense. Like,
I haven't ever read Baudrillard. I've read people talking about him.
yes, a lot of it. It's odd. I think his work has aged
Yeah.
pretty well, surprisingly, because he's writing right after the post Fukuyama stuff. All this stuff. The end of history.
Yes.
And I think he does say some true things and has some interesting insights.
Yes.
But it is wrapped up in this. We've talked about this before. The weird, continental philosophy, like where it can be very difficult to ascertain. What's going on.
I think my stereotype about continentals is that they very often have neat insights, but they have very ineffective error correcting mechanisms, which means not only aren't they rigorous, but they have a very hard time reorienting if they get a bad idea in their head. They don't have a mechanism in place that will pull them around to, no, that turned out to be false.
Right. Which is a bit of a problem.
Yeah. It means you at least you need to exercise care reading them, which can be fun.
Definitely. This actually, so I wanted to circle back to one of the problems we were talking about, and Peter Thiel mentions this, and I feel this and I see this. It's where he describes how. So we talked about the thinking thing, like maybe people are just not critically thinking and taking the time, and why that maybe has changed. And the second thing he talks about, which I think is interesting, he's like, well, all of the people starting these big companies where there's a lot of profit involved, so they found something other people are missing. They see the people that start these seem to be suffering from at least a mild form of Asperger's.
Yes.
Which he describes as a change over time.
Yeah.
Is there some sense in which people have just gotten too invested in copying each other?
My gut says yes.
And and has that changed?
I would expect I would expect one thing that sort of shakes people out of playing roles is mortal danger, and there's less of that.
Gotcha.
I don't think that's the whole story.
So it's like something where we're all dancing in this safe garden. It's well,
yeah, that's got to be part of it. And maybe that's the root of it, but I don't feel like that's all of it. Maybe indirectly. Maybe we've always copied each other, but one of the behaviors to copy was orienting to the object level, and we're seeing fewer people do that now.
Gotcha. Less cost associated.
Yeah, I have a family member who was observing the people at her work when we knew COVID was coming and when we were reading about it. And she was surprised that a lot of the stuff they were doing did not seem to be in their interests.
Yeah.
And I think she was thinking of them as maybe selfish, but not as essentially thinking on the object level, modeling COVID for themselves and coming to their own conclusions.
Yeah.
And so she was surprised when they were doing things that didn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
And I think a lot of what people do is playing roles. And that's maybe accelerated over time.
Yeah. Well, it is disturbing that if something like COVID doesn't work, and I think we've talked about this with V as well.
Yes.
What does work, right?
Yes.
It's I don't know. And in some sense, maybe it wasn't vivid enough. Maybe it's, it mostly kills older people.
Yeah.
It's we've put those people away. We don't really,
yes.
It's not like the ancestral environment where you had old people around all the time. We've gotten quite atomized. And
I feel like, she was imagining that they would see COVID coming before anyone they knew had died. And maybe you can't when you're in that state.
Right.
Something really bad has to happen.
Yeah.
It's one of those, I had something I wanted, but I can't remember what it was. It seemed important. think there are a whole class of things that are... It's hard to talk about people not thinking critically because it's very blame adjacent. And
Right.
one of the hazards is that people will assume that you're euphemistically saying something else that's emotionally aligned. So I kept talking to this family member and saying they're not thinking about this on the object level. They process social cues. And she was surprised that they weren't thinking about it on the object level, even when it was in their interest to do so.
Right.
So it was like I was saying they're not thinking it through critically. And she was hearing that as they're being selfish, maybe. And so she
Gotcha.
was surprised when they weren't being effectively selfish.
Right. And then the second thing is like, well, yeah, like maybe they're not really being selfish because, like, you know, the other, there's no real benefit. Like, there's more like maybe social benefit to like not caring or something.
Yes. I think this is probably one of those things that it's a question of degree. But I think for most of my life, I've badly underestimated how little people are executing high-level heuristics. We interviewed Zvi Maushowitz on this,
Yeah.
and he goes farther than I do. He says that people at the fourth simulacra level have lost the ability to think about the object level at all. That they can't plan, that they don't have
all
goals.
virtualized.
Yeah, that they have systems, that they have heuristics, and they always execute those heuristics.
Right.
But I'm also sort of dodging the question of why and if this has gotten worse over time. And intuitively, I really, really feel like it has. But I don't have a great explanation for that. I actually think is the explanation.
Right. Well, it does seem like a way you could get at this is to go somewhere with a much lower standard of living than here in the U.S.
Yes.
and just like and do like case studies or just like try and figure out, you know, how do people approach these problems and like what does that look like and is it different?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's very bizarre.
Yeah. Maybe people in lower abundance societies, including our past society, looked like they were doing more object level thinking than they were because the rate of change was slower, and so cultural evolution was able to adapt their heuristics faster.
Gotcha. Maybe talk about that a little bit. So it's thing where like things are like relatively static. There's low growth, so things just don't change.
Yes. Well, in that environment, some behaviors put you in a good place, and some behaviors put you in a bad place. And people can watch each other and copy the behaviors that put them in a good place. So I think the example people tend to go to is maniac. I wish I could. That herb, it has cyanide in it, but very low levels, but you don't want to eat it over time. And some primitive people, I wish I could remember exactly where, but
I think it's in Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah.
have culturally evolved elaborate preparation procedures, but they don't know why they're doing it.
Yeah. Or they tell you it's like, well, because, you know, like, I don't know if this is the case, but it's something like, well, you know, there's bad spirits, or there's some
Yes.
like religious, or like, you know, the monster will come get you if you don't prepare it like this, or something.
Yes.
And in reality, you're preventing.
Yeah, we never say we don't know why we're doing this.
Right. Now, you say you have a reason, but
It's not always. So, in a society that's changing very rapidly, the process that gets you there is going to have trouble. But in a society that's not changing very rapidly, you could have a lot of behaviors that look like they're motivated by consequentialist reasoning, but are actually the same process we're seeing now. It just works much better when there isn't rapid change.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. It does lead me to think that, especially in the ancestral environment, there's severe consequences for not following traditions, breaking taboos, like we talked about.
Yeah.
You eat the food and then you don't prepare it right. You're like, this is stupid. I know there aren't spirits, and then you end up dying.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, but you think there would be less of that in the modern world because the consequences are lower.
Yeah.
Generally, I would feel like.
You'd feel like people would have more slack.
They'd have more slack to not just blindly follow and copy.
Yes. And also, we have, I know how this is going to sound, I'm sorry, but we have science now. I mean, to some extent, more than we used to, we have science. And that means that we're doing more consequentialist reasoning that's available.
Right.
Like, if the explanation is evil spirits, and everyone kind of knows, I don't know if everyone kind of knows that's not the real explanation.
Right.
But if it's a fake explanation, then trying to do your own thinking is a really bad idea.
Yeah.
If we've gotten better at articulating the actual reasons, then the advantage of doing your own thinking should have gone up some.
Right.
And maybe has. I mean...
Yeah. This reminds me, have you read any Taleb by any chance?
Just a couple of essays.
Just a couple of essays?
I wanted him to occupy one of my Dunbar slots,
Nice.
so I read enough for my brain to start parsing him as a person. But
Gotcha. Any thoughts so far?
I like his stuff on intolerant minorities. That seems like a really important contribution to game theory.
Yeah.
That because I think we do have an intuition that if most people want a thing, that thing tends to happen. And
Yeah.
I think we see that dynamic fail again and again and again. And it's really interesting why. I mean, without judging whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Gotcha. Before I get into that, can you describe what intolerant minorities are? That's important.
If a small group of people have a very strong preference, and it's a very strong preference, or they're somehow committed to not tolerating people who violate the preference, they're able to get their way more than we would expect, even if it's a very small minority. So he uses smoking and non-smoking sections as an illustration. You can sit in the smoking section and not smoke, and no one will have a problem.
Yeah.
But if you sit in the non-smoking section and smoke, people will have a problem.
Yeah. Got it. Is this kind of like bootleggers and Baptists and like Mansur Olson and thinking about like, it's
I think so, yeah.
like concentrated minorities can really like where, if we all benefit like a little bit from so I wrote this paper on car dealerships
Yeah.
in college, and it was like, if you look at car dealerships, they suck up all the profits. They add like a lot of cost to new vehicles. I can't remember the exact figures anymore. They add a lot. They add like 5% of the cost of new vehicles.
Yes.
Don't really add anything versus just ordering it from the manufacturer. But the problem is like for all the manufacturers to get together and like, just start delivering vehicles. And they've actually written laws where you can't directly buy
Yes.
automobiles from manufacturers, which is like, and actually Tesla has like had to fight a lot of this. And the question is like, well, like, yeah, it's like, it's cost me an extra 5% to buy a car, but I don't really have like, it's not my livelihood. So I don't have time to go like worry about this. But all the car dealers, this is their entire livelihood. They can spend a lot of money.
Yes.
Make that happen.
Really important dynamic. I mean, concentrated, you're saying, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but concentrated interest groups end up having so much more power than we expect them to.
Yeah.
And I think we attach fake explanations to that. I think very often, I've had several conversations in the last 2 weeks that struck me from different angles how much people are equating money and power. And I think a lot of the times you have a concentrated interest group using their power to get money, and then people point to the money as the root of the problem.
Yes. And it does seem like money can be converted to like small legislative tweaks.
Yeah.
Like pretty like robustly, I think.
Yeah, and I think you might small legislative tweaks pretty consistently, and I think you might have I think Zvi suggests at one place that you'll have much more success if you're trying to use it to stop things from happening.
Interesting.
Which makes sense if I think about it, because everyone knows how not to do things.
Right.
So, if you need people to not do things, you don't have to find the people who know how to do them and ensure that they're doing them well.
Right. You just have to say no. Yeah. So maybe stopping things, like small legislative tweaks that are stopping things, seems to work well for that. It seems to work much less well in terms of like you look at ad spending for politicians, and like it doesn't seem like I think there was some paper I read. It's like once you get above $1 million, you have to like double the amount of money to add like some small percentage point gain. It's like they're very like marginal gains, and we even saw this. Like I think Hillary Clinton spent more than $1 billion.
Yes,
and it didn't work. Like
no, it seems like name recognition is important, and money buys that.
So once you get that past that bar,
but it doesn't.
It doesn't like one-to-one transfer to like imposing your will.
No, I think people. Well, actually, I think cultural evolution is doing something kind of wonky here.
Oh yeah.
Money is very legible. It's optimized to be legible. I mean, and so if you're going to tell a story about, say, a corrupt politician who is making bad decisions on purpose to get gains, you want to depict that politician being paid in money, because the audience will immediately understand it. Yes. It will be utterly ambiguous what's happening. Now, for the same reason, if you're an actual corrupt politician, you want to get paid in just about anything other than money. It's way less legible. It's way harder to get caught. It's way more ambiguous what you're doing. Yeah. And so I think we've landed in a situation where just about, I think I would say over 90% of the people doing the thing that we mean when we say corruption are taking payment in things that aren't money. And all of our stories depict them getting paid in money. So people see the money as this huge problem. Right.
Yeah. Because it's very legible, like you said. I think you're right. Sorry, I kind of sidetracked us with that, but I think that was really good. So getting back to Taleb, I've been reading one of his works, and I don't want to misrepresent it because, it's complicated work, and there's a lot going on in the book. And it's well written. It's quite entertaining, which that's an art form. Yeah. But, I've been reading Anti-Fragile, and I find it's quite interesting. Taleb is very skeptical of humans' ability to, like, rationally figure things out.
Yes.
And then go. Like, so his big example recently in the book, drug discovery.
Yeah.
Like, he goes through all these different, and he recommended a book on it, and I read the adjacent book on drug discovery. I can't remember the name. And it goes through essentially every major medication we've discovered, and essentially every single one, someone finds some big effect, like some huge effect, and then applies it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Like one of the first cancer chemotherapy drugs, it was something related to some soldiers in World War II. We had them on a transport ship, and this was declassified relatively recently because we had mustard gas on the transport ship when we weren't, weren't supposed to do that. And somehow, it got shelled or something, and the mustard gas got released, and a bunch of soldiers got exposed to it. And somehow later they found out there was like either lower rates of cancer or someone with cancer on the boat, and they were able to connect this back. But it's not like we figured out, okay, like this is how cancer works. This is how we fix it. It's like we find which I don't know. It seems like it tension a little bit with like what you were talking about going to space.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Do you have any thoughts on that? Are these just like completely discrete things that, I don't know, like some processes work certain ways, and I don't know.
It's
Exactly where I'm going with that.
I think there seems to be. It's important to keep a couple of things straight, separate.
Yeah.
There seems to be. I think there seems to be more reasoning from first principles than there is, because that's what we backfill when we find something.
Right.
So we might live in a world where we always claim that we got there partly from reasoning from first principles. I don't think we literally always, and very often that's not what happened. And that's distinct from the question of where reasoning from a first principles is a good strategy going forward.
Right.
You can have a situation where a particular strategy tends to produce good results, but very many people claim to have used the strategy who haven't. And so it's simultaneously true that usually people haven't actually thought it through from first principles, and that it's a good idea.
Gotcha. So maybe it's like the story we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
Like afterwards.
Yes.
Like I tend to think this is a fairly strongly held belief. I think the reasons people do things in general, like do anything, it's like obscure and weird, and it's very rarely like someone sat down and thought about it and like made a plan and then concretely. But I think it's important to do that. I do think it's very important to do that and underrated. But generally, I think it's like. But then we go back and we feel when you ask someone why they did something, they fill back in.
Yes.
With something like robust.
Explicit reasoning, and people confabulating explanations, which you're right, happens constantly.
It does seem to be. And I even see this in my own life. And it's something I really try, I make it like, I try and really fight it, because I think I do think it's a bad thing. Like, you should try and, have a plan and try and like at least have and direct somewhere.
Yep.
I think, because otherwise you just end up wherever. And I think most people just end up wherever because of like really weird reasons that aren't good. And it's like, you try and fight that as much as you can. I don't know. Yeah.
I agree. I'm not great about it. But
no,
I agree
it's very difficult. I mean, it's even a question of to what extent is it possible to do that. But I think it's probably worth trying is the conclusion I've come to.
Huh.
I want to shift a little bit.
Yeah.
It's an odd question, but I think it's an interesting question I've been wanting to talk to you about. Someone was talking about recently, this was more common with the new atheist movement.
Yeah.
Like a while back. But they were talking about, the how it was very unlikely that there was very little evidence of, of Christ being resurrected or something like that. Which actually got me thinking, what bar of evidence should we expect to have if an ancient Sumerian man,
yes,
yes, like 2,000 years ago was resurrected? What evidence would we have?
It's a good, yeah.
It's kind of like this thought. It's just a thought experiment, right? Like, I've had. I don't know. Like, what do you think about that? And in the context of, I see, we have trouble even determining what happened. Where COVID came from. Yeah.
Well, I think people have a real tendency to emphasize thresholds in their beliefs, which are kind of artificial. So we're going to have a probability. Just about any time people start talking about burden of proof, it makes sense in a criminal trial that you need a threshold of probability to vote to convict.
Right.
There's a specific action. But most beliefs aren't like that. You have a probability that they're true.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you're not thinking of it that way explicitly.
There is some sense in which, So,
historically, just sort of the orthodox Bayesian thing would be we look at evidential fit and prior probability. And prior probability is an area where people, I think that's where the disagreements tend to happen.
Gotcha.
Although, I mean, they don't never happen about evidential fit. And I see people a lot of the time exaggerating evidential fit because they're very confident of the prior probability. So they say something is very strong evidence of X, whereas, it's really very weak evidence of X, but they really believe X is true.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think it's an interesting question. It's going to vary. Some people are going to have different prior probabilities that happened. But I think you're right that the evidential fit, I'm really looking at the society in which we live now. I am amazed that we have any remotely accurate records from the past.
Yeah, I know, right? You're like, oh my God. Yes. It's interesting. Like, I like to go back and read old issues of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Because the Atlantic, started in like 1800, 1800 something.
Bertrand Russell wrote an article for them once.
Right.
At least once that I know of. In 1922, I think.
That's awesome. So, yeah, it's like, it's super interesting to go back and you can read these and like, because I read it now, it gives me a certain context. I'm like, okay. And it's not the same exactly, but you get a view on like what people were thinking and how different it was.
I really like that about historical sources.
Yeah. But there, and there's something like even special about it being something you consume now.
Yeah.
It's like somewhat similar, and then it's like, okay, like you can try and find the things that are really different and weird.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have scattershot impressions of them. It's generally favorable for things in that class, but I'm generally pretty down on things in that class.
Yeah.
But definitely some really good articles today, and definitely some really good articles historically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting just to get back and see it. Well, anyway, we've talked about a lot today.
Yeah.
Hierarchy. Any final thoughts you have on the subject currently?
I don't think so. I think it's interesting. It would be interesting, and I haven't done the mental work that I would need to do to start doing this, but there's the question of status, and then there's the actual structure of the hierarchy. And it's interesting I think Sarah Constantin has a post where she notes that in birds, pecking order and flight leadership aren't correlated.
Oh, really?
So you have decision makers who aren't receiving what we would think of as status rewards.
Gotcha.
I think there are probably some interesting insights about hierarchy as distinct from status, and there are definitely some interesting insights about status as distinct from hierarchy and the relationship. And whether the relationship could be different. I think it's either Zvi Mowshowitz or Benjamin Hoffman comments at one point that it would be interesting to try to buy off the bad decision makers who care about status with status while reducing their actual impact on events.
Nice. That would be wise.
Yeah.
That'd be very wise. Yeah, I really like that. Well, I definitely think it's an interesting subject, and I think it's one that is comparatively understudied.
Yeah.
Definitely. And especially RE, its importance.
Yeah. Which is good.
Which is good. Well, Quinn, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me so
Absolutely.
much. It's real good.
Definitely. We'll have you back on again soon.
Yeah, I would really like that.
Awesome. Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
Join us next week for more narratives.